Southwest Florida, welcome back to Lee Pitts Live. We're so thrilled to be here, Johnny on the spot, at Mount Olive AME Church parking lot here in the Dunbar community in Fort Myers. If you're looking at us around the country, Fort Myers is located in the southwest quadrant of the state of Florida, and the state of Florida is in national news now as probably going to be the epicenter for the COVID-19 virus. We have some education going on here related to the virus. We have speakers on the stage who are talking about it. We're going to have foods being served under the leadership of Pastor Givens. This is a spectacular affair, and Lee Pitts Live is here, Johnny on the spot. We have COVID testing here. I'm going to try to get my tests along the way, but in the meantime, we also have a great educator here who is an activist in the community. You've seen him, one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Fort Myers in Southwest Florida. So without further ado, we welcome the Professor, Lodovic Kimble. Welcome to Lee Pitts Live, man.
Thank you. Thank God for the room, as I always say.
Hey, first of all, talk about that hat you got on, bro.
Well, the hat's from Ghana. You know, I sell African art, so this is just one of the things I own. And when it got hot out here, I walk around with an umbrella. I said, why get an umbrella? I got a hat that's like an umbrella. Go get it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, man. I've have to conduct my interviews with over 6 feet of space that we have right here, but you still come up and you make sure I'm on this spot. Lodovic Kimble, first of all, why is it important for you to have come out to this today?
Well, I think that all efforts that demonstrate that we're standing up against social justice, that we need to support it. The very first rally that we had, I was there to make sure that there was no nonviolence. That there was no violence, and that we maintain order in our demonstration, because our cause is against violence, not instituting it at the same time. So this church gathering here is an opportunity for the community to come out, hear community leaders, and hear where they stand in our fight for social justice.
Outstanding. Now, before we move a little farther through this interview, I want to take the opportunity to congratulate you. I think you retired this year after over 25 years in education. Go ahead and expound on that.
Actually, 39 years here in Fort Myers,
old dude,
43 years in education that began at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee.
Now, you were, at an early age, people need to know, you didn't just pop up out the tulip tree and start talking about social activism. You were one of the first. You were the first African American one of the first African Americans to integrate an all-white club at your high school. Speak to that.
Well, yes, we did. You saw that picture I posted on Facebook. We had a club called the Southern Gentlemen, and it was made up of all-white males. And my senior year, I said to 3 males, we're going to join that club, and they're not going to keep us from joining it. And when we joined, you notice the picture. One brother standing in the back, me and Tom Stalin standing on the front row, demonstrating that we're going to take our place among those men, the Southern Gentlemen.
You've seen a lot of various movements over the years of your activism. You see the movement that is taking place here locally and nationally, all races joining into the movement. Do you think that this type of movement, mainly centered around George Floyd's murder, is going to make a huge difference in America as we move forward?
George Floyd was the antecedent for this protest, but not the beginning, because they've been killing, raping, and murdering black men and women since 1492. This is nothing new. People keep talking about 400 years ago, 1619. 1492, when Columbus came, he assaulted the Taino people, brought here an African who was enslaved on his ship as his first mate. So you have slavery that actually began in South and Central America far before the United States, and first they enslaved the indigenous people. So when they killed Trayvon Martin, a small child walking with Skittles in his hand and a soda, that was a total miscarriage of justice that George Zimmerman got away with that. Then we went on and we lost a young man in St. Louis. Then we lost a young man that was strangled to death in New York. It has been too much. We've had enough. We also recently had those 2 African Americans that were killed in Texas, shot inside of their own houses. One woman only gets 10 years. The other man does not even get arrested for this murder. We've had enough. We're tired of them murdering our children. We're tired of them raping our women. We've had enough. We're not tolerating it anymore.
Okay. Now, the you're a big proponent of get out the vote. Make your case right now as we move into early voting.
Well, we only have two weapons. We make up 14% of the population. The only weapon we have
Which
is
population
the power of
you
protest.
You speaking of national or locally?
Nationally.
14%. Okay.
Two weapons.
When you say we, who is
We as Africans and brown people.
Okay.
The power of protest and the power of the vote. And now we see a new one when we're learning how important the census is. If we are counted, that determines dollars to come to our community. If we vote, we can help shape policy, put people in office who make decisions that include us in that process than making us exclusive as they have in the past.
I see. What are you saying now when you're out on the stomp, when you're talking to people? I know you seem like you're covering three things. You're covering get out the vote. You're covering safety as it relates to this pandemic. You're also talking about social unrest, justice. You are a big component of nonviolent protests. Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
So when you saw the looting and all that was taking place, what was going through your mind on that front and the police confrontations?
When the looting first occurred as a result of some protesters, I tried to help people to empathize that it was pent up anger and frustration. But as we look further at who was doing the looting, we noticed most of the looters were outside agitators and white supremacists trying to blame this on the African nonviolent protesters. This is nothing new. In 1980, I participated in a protest in Nashville to keep tennis stars from coming from South Africa to play at Vanderbilt. We had European American protesters, but they were the first to pick up a rock and throw it at the police, and then we get beat down. So what we have to understand is some of these European Americans who join us don't understand the power of protest. They assume if they burn down a building or disface a building that they're helping the cause. They're not helping the cause. They're looking like criminals. That's not what we're about.
Mm-hmm. So are you encouraging or are you disencouraging other people being a part of the movement?
I'm encouraging, and in fact, I'm a little disappointed that we don't have more leadership. I think that more black leaders need to step up front to show where they stand. They need to at least speak out. I had a day of outrage. I was disappointed in how few black leaders actually showed up. The majority of people there were the Black Lives Matter movement and Europeans Against Racism. I gave a speech which I summarized part of Martin Luther King's speech, Where Do We Go From Here? Dr. Shanetta Brunson was the only other community leader there. This is kind of stuff I'm talking about. Even yesterday with the 1,000-man march, I was disappointed how few black men were there and that our community, about 40, 50 people there, and at least half of them were European American.
What do you attribute that to?
Apathy. Also, too many in our community won't change, but we're waiting for everybody else to do the work while we benefit. And you heard me criticize people from the Caribbean the other day. I meet too many of them have the nerves to tell me I'm not an American, but lived here 4 decades, and so the Black Lives Matter movement is not my issue. And then endorse a white male who lived next to him who had frames a Confederate flag. That brother's quite confused. You know what I said to that brother? Take a walk down Buckingham at night and call me the next morning.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Lodovic, I want to get a couple of questions in with you before I move on to my next interview. You mentioned the Confederate flag. I want to lump it all together, the Confederate flag, some of the statues that are around the country represent the Confederate soldiers that are being torn down. And there's a movement to just totally annihilate the Confederate flag from the landscape of America, put it in a museum. And many say that it represents the slavery, oppression, and glorifying soldiers and images that fought against the union of these United States of America. What's your thought, first of all, on the removal of all of these images from view in society that represent that period of time?
Well, people need to study Louis Gate and go back and see the document he had on what happened after slavery. When we signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that should have ended slavery, but it only ended in the states seceded from the Union. When we ended the Civil War, that should have ended slavery. but Europeans ran to Texas and Louisiana to continue. So on June 19th, 1865, we had to send federal troops in to bring it in. When President Johnson took over, he was no friend of the African, and Frederick Douglass said that. He allowed the South to continue the persecution and enslavement of Africans even when it didn't exist. There's a book that says Slavery by Another Name. It tells you that slavery lasted until 1942, 11 years before I was born. So part of the issue is today is that we have to realize that this is the most socially untenable behavior, probably the worst thing that ever happened in the world to any one group of people, next to the Holocaust, where they try to exterminate Jews within 6 years. We have to stand up to say very strongly that it's time for change. And the young people who are coming forth today are a multicultural group of people who have seen the troubles in our country, and they're saying, we don't want trouble no more.
We'll come back to that in a second. You guys hearing those horns blowing? We have a bunch of cars that are here. We have our cameraman just pan over right there. As you take a look, we got cars that are here in the parking lot here at Mount Olive AME Church. And they're social distancing if they want to for the program that's taking place over my shoulder. Lee Pitts Live, of course, the media sponsors here for this civic engagement in the community put on by Mount Olive AME Church, if I made a mistake. And we're so thrilled to have the eminent Professor Lodovic Kimble here. One of the things you talked about is the book about slavery that still exists up into the 1940s. And that book I got a chance to read, of course, and you well know that a lot of that slavery took place in my hometown, Birmingham, Alabama, in the steel mills.
Yes, sir.
And down there in the coal, the mountains bringing out coal. And these, many of them were prisoners that was used to do slavery work.
That's right.
Expound on that, my friend.
In fact, Africans were being picked up on the street, accused of crimes, not given a trial, forced to work in industry, private plantation, private farms, chain gangs, and put in prison against their will.
And when you are reading these types of things, and you are looking at things that are coming out of the White House, and putting all of that together, when many say that our president is not showing leadership in many aspects of what's happening right now, what are your thoughts?
This president has never shown leadership even during his campaign. It was very clear that he was unqualified for the position before his campaign. You got to understand that what's happening is European Americans feel the browning of America. What this is Donald Trump is the great white hope. And they was hoping he was able to save this racist society to maintain the same image it's always had. That's what conservatism is. It means standing in one place and never changing, keeping things as they always are. The Democrats consider ourselves progressive. We won't change. We want a pluralistic society. We want a society that's fully inclusive. And if you look at the makeup of the Democrats, we are quite diversely mixed, and nobody paid us to stand behind the speaker.
So, how much of the problem with the spread of the pandemic do you blame on the policies of the White House?
A great deal. We would not have had 100,000 deaths had Donald Trump adhered to the warning when we first heard about it in China. It would have been different here if we did testing, tracking here in this country. We did not. You had a president who denounced it. This is a hoax. This don't exist. He was discriminatory about claiming it's a Chinese disease. Last week he called it the Kung Fu Chinese disease. This is how far this guy went. You have to admit that you have a person in office who calls himself president, but he practices ignorance with enthusiasm.
What do you say to those people who say people are going to vote for Joe Biden not because of Joe Biden's policies, that they're just voting against Donald Trump, and Joe Biden brings nothing really to the table that black people in particular can point to as benefiting us over the years? Go.
I disagree with that because people haven't looked at Joe Biden's track record. Joe Biden in his younger days probably made some mistakes like most other whites. He was raised in the same white racist family like most of them, but through his years, Joe Biden grew. Or Barack would have chose him as his vice president. And during the time he was vice president, never did he try to undermine Barack. He stood beside Barack. Never did he publicly criticize Barack. Not one did he try to make Barack look lower than him. He played his role and played his role well. He is the alternative, not Donald Trump. And if you are voting for Joe Biden because he is the lesser of the evil, more power to you. Because you vote for Donald Trump, you're voting for more of the same.
What's the probability of Donald Trump, the Republican Party, attracting more African Americans into the party? We have a Republican standing right here, if I'm not mistaken, Charles Daly.
Yep.
Your fraternity brother, Kappa Alpha Psi. You guys are two different spectrums of the political sphere?
Well, there's a difference here. This is a different type of brother. Every black who's a Republican don't necessarily think that way. You got a lot of African Americans who are Republicans, they feel like they need to see what they're doing on that side. When you challenge that brother and talk about what he thinks about, you'll find that that brother thinks just like me. The sad thing is when we find brothers like that brother in Naples who sells out and embraces Donald Trump. The sad thing is when you find brothers like Ben Carson. You and I looked up as a hero and find Ben Carson selling out the African American community. You know, Lee, you probably read my post on Facebook, and you've heard people criticize me for using the word Uncle Tom, which existed far before I was born. It's always been able to
Ben Donaldson, Congressman Donaldson.
Yeah.
In Naples.
Yeah, describe an African American who sells out the community as an Uncle Tom. Today we got many types of them: Motisas, Incog Negroes, test tube suburban Negroes, Black Anglo-Saxons, and Buthelezes.
Well, you got your 2 cents in for sure. We'll be talking to you more as we progress through the primaries and the general election. Always good to have you stop by. You always in the community, showing your face and not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
We'll be right back.